Konasatoshi of YouTube, I am the Sceptical Leprechaun, and welcome to the channel where we get drunk on reason. In my last video, we explored the cosmological argument as presented by Thomas Aquinas. We saw that Aquinas built his argument upon Aristotelian foundations and came up with no less than 5 ways of proving God's existence. For the sake of practicality and in the consideration of time, I chose to narrow my focus on 2 of Aquinas' 5 ways. As I stated in my previous video, if you would like me to discuss Aquinas' 4th and 5th ways in a future video, please do leave a comment below. What follows then is a critique of Aquinas' 2nd and 3rd ways of knowing God's existence. These are, of course, the arguments from causation and contingency. The argument from causation can be summarized by pointing out 2 supposedly obvious facts. Fact 1, nothing can cause itself, and fact 2, the idea of an infinite universe is a ridiculous one. With these 2 facts in mind, Aquinas suggests that there must be an uncaused cause for the universe. Otherwise, as Aquinas might put it, we are faced with the ridiculous possibility that the universe created itself, or that the universe is indeed infinite. So what is the problem with this argument? Does it constitute evidence for the existence of a prime mover, or has Aquinas missed the mark? Enter David Hume. Oh, sorry, I'm just taking a break. You see, Hume is a guy who's going to just destroy these arguments. He's not going to need my help. To be fair, he's the godfather of modern skeptical thinking. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to get back to drinking my tea. Thanks very much. David Hume was a Scottish philosopher and historian who's best known for his robust and systematic rebuttal of any or all attempts to posit the existence of the supernatural. It is true to say that modern skeptics, such as myself and others, are standing on the shoulders of giants. In fact, it wouldn't be unreasonable to say that Hume is the godfather of modern skeptical thinking. In response to Aquinas, it was Hume who pointed out that the argument from causation commits the fallacy of composition. The fallacy of composition is the fallacy of inferring that something is true of the whole from the fact that it is true of part of the whole, or of every part of the whole. To clarify Hume's point, here's a simple example. Hydrogen is not wet, nor is oxygen. Therefore, water is not wet. Needless to say, this is a fallacious argument. Just because the parts of a whole follow the same logic, or indeed contain the same characteristics, does not mean that the whole itself has these same qualities. Hume makes this point in relation to the first 2 premises of Aquinas' causation argument. This is where, to paraphrase, Aquinas makes the claim that because nothing within the universe can cause itself, that therefore the universe cannot cause itself. Bertrand Russell, a British philosopher, logician, and all-round skeptical and intellectual heavyweight, made this same point in his 1948 radio debate with none other than F.C. Copleston. What follows is a brief extract from said debate, wherein Russell identifies the fallacy of composition within Copleston's own rendition of the argument from causation.
The whole concept of cause is one we derive from our observation of particular things. I see no reason whatsoever to suppose that the total has any cause whatsoever. I can illustrate what seems to me to be your fallacy. Every man who exists has a mother, and it seems to be your argument is, therefore the human race must have a mother. But obviously the human race hasn't a mother. That's a different logical sphere.
As you can see, and as Russell so eloquently puts it, it would be illogical to assume, on the basis that all human beings have a mother, that therefore the human race has a mother. From the perspective of thinkers such as Hume and Russell, the logical underpinnings of the motherhood argument are directly analogous to what Aquinas is presenting in his argument from causation. Suffice to say, it is unreasonable to conclude that the universe has a cause or a beginning just because things within the universe have causes and beginnings. This brings us to Aquinas' 3rd way, the argument from contingency, which, again, can be summarized with reference to two seemingly obvious facts. Fact 1. If absolutely everything in existence is contingent upon something else for its existence, we have no choice but to accept the conclusion that the past is infinite. Fact 2. The seemingly ridiculous idea of an infinite past points inevitably in the direction of a non-contingent first cause, namely God. In response to this idea that there must exist a non-contingent being at the start of everything, Hume said the following: "The true state of the question is, whether every object which begins to exist must owe its existence to a cause, and this I assert neither to be intuitively nor demonstratively certain." Needless to say, Hume here is challenging the third premise of Aquinas' contingency argument. This is the premise where Aquinas asserts that there must exist a necessary being, which in turn causes contingent beings. But as Hume points out, this assertion is something that would have to be demonstrated. To quote the late and great Christopher Hitchens, that which can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed as such. Hume goes on to point out that it is illogical to assert that any being's existence could be necessary. As Hume put it himself, whatever we conceive as existent, we can also conceive as non-existent. There is no being, therefore, whose non-existence implies a contradiction. Hume clarified this argument with reference to analytic and synthetic statements. Analytic conclusions are those arrived at by logic alone, whereas synthetic conclusions require sense experience. So how are these terms relevant to Aquinas' third way and Hume's rejection of it? Simply put, it's not difficult to detect in Aquinas' third way an attempt to prove God's existence logically. Due to the supposed ridiculousness of an infinite past, Aquinas argues that there is a logical necessity for a non-contingent being at the beginning of it all. Such argumentation is analytic in nature, as it attempts to logically prove God's existence. But even if we accepted Aquinas' argument that there must be a non-contingent cause at the beginning of it all, who's to say that that cause is God? This kind of reasoning amounts to nothing more than a basic argument from ignorance. An argument from ignorance fallacy rests on the assumption that the proponent's conclusion is true, simply because no alternatives have been presented. This fallacy is apparent in Aquinas' argument, where he assumes that this uncaused, non-contingent being must be God. Why couldn't that cause be a non-contingent alien being? What's more, it's simply a failure of the imagination if one cannot conceive of a non-contingent universe. Either way, Hume argues that all statements about existence are synthetic, in that they require sense experience to be proven. If you doubt this claim, and believe perhaps that logic can be the ultimate arbiter when it comes to existential propositions, please consider the following. Logic happens entirely in your mind. It is a method that uses premises, and premises can reflect reality or fantasy. For example, Spider-Man is a New Yorker. New Yorkers exist, therefore Spider-Man exists. The problem is this: despite the logical validity of this argument, in order to know that the conclusion is true, one requires some form of observation. Hume and Russell merely argue that the same is true of God. In summary, 2 + 2 = 4 is an analytic statement, meaning it is logically true. On the other hand, statements such as Peter Pan exists, Hume exists, I exist, God exists, these kinds of statements are synthetic in nature. In other words, none of those statements can ever be logically true. Rather, I can only know if they're true or false synthetically or by experience. Here's another extract from Russell's radio debate with Copleston, wherein he clarifies this point.
Rational animals are animals is an analytic proposition. But a proposition such as this is an animal can never be analytic. Therefore, it will follow that it cannot be an analytic proposition ever to say that this or that exists. Take, for example, suppose you take as your subject the existent round square. It would look like an analytic proposition that the existent round square exists, but it doesn't exist.
In conclusion, Aquinas' second and third ways for proving God's existence fail, because both arguments contain assertions for which no evidence is provided. What's more, both arguments commit the fallacy of composition. And lastly, Aquinas is guilty of claiming that existential propositions, such as God exists, can be proven logically. And that, ladies and gentlemen, brings us to the end of the video. If you liked it, leave a like. If you didn't, blame God. For anything else, please leave a comment below. I have been the Sceptical Leprechaun. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you very much for watching. Slán go fóill.